Hello my dear friends, you're in the MilitarySummary channel, and in this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Moscow because we have very important phone call between Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. They held a telephone conversation to continue what officials described as a productive exchange of views on key aspects of the recently intensified Russian-American political dialogue, according to a statement from the Russian foreign minister. The discussion primarily focused on the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Both diplomats emphasized the importance of creating the necessary conditions for negotiations aimed at agreeing on a roadmap towards a lasting peace in Ukraine, the ministry added. Right before this talk, Sergei Lavrov made a lot of important statements to the US media. If you want a ceasefire just to continue supplying arms to Ukraine, what is your purpose? That was the question that Lavrov asked the US journalist. Another important statement: Russia has not received any offer from the United States to transfer control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. If necessary, the Russian Federation will explain to the United States that the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is in safe hands and changes in its control are impossible, he added. Trump told the truth about the ownership of Crimea. He understands that Russia is not negotiating the integrity of its territory. That was also stated by Lavrov. Another important state that Russia has not received any proposal, from the US to lift sanctions, but Washington is interested in doing business together. Lavrov denied that Russia is not ready to make any concessions regarding Ukraine. Moscow is ready to seek a balance of interests. Trump told the truth about the ownership of Crimea. He understands that Russia is not negotiating the integrity of its territory. So we see that, and this is very interesting and very important, because Russia, for the first time since the US plans about the peaceful settlement were revealed, gave their own understanding of the situation. And we see that despite the fact that the Russian authorities told us in the past that there are lots of common things and that the positions of the United States of America and the Russian Federation are almost equal, we see that there are lots of differences, and we see that the Russians probably don't accept a lot of important points from this peaceful plan. So anyway, this week is very important according to Marco Rubio and according to the President of the United States of America. So of course, let's wait and see what is going to be next. As for now, we see that Ukrainian concessions are inevitable. Russia has won the war of attrition. Retired British Army Colonel Richard Kemp admitted that Kiev has no choice but to agree to Donald Trump's latest proposal. He also noted that Kiev's European allies continue to criticize all peace initiatives of the White House, although they have not proposed any alternative solution to the situation other than continuing military action. So that was stated by different military authorities of the Western countries. So despite the fact that there are lots of talks and that this week is probably the most important, we see that nobody is ready to stop this war, and the Russians continue their offensive operation. So now let's discuss what kind of changes the previous 12 hours brought us. And first let's talk about the Sumy direction, where according to information we have the group of forces Kursk continued their offensive operation, and during the previous night, during the previous 12 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Yunakievka. We have adjusted the map based on the video that was published by the Russian sources. I'll remind you that yesterday we colored the northern part of the settlement of Loknya, and today we got additional details that confirm that the Russians managed to improve their positions much further in the southern and the southwestern directions. Let's take a look at this video, and in this video we can see how the Russian troopers were returning back after they landed in this area or brought some reinforcements and reserves. Russian vehicles were moving exactly in this point. Later, those vehicles that you just seen in the video were attacked by the Ukrainians and they were destroyed. Anyway, this video confirms that the Russians most likely control these three belts, and they continue advancing further with the purpose to outflank the settlement of Yunakievka from the northwest and from the west. At the same time, the Russians increased their pressure on the settlement by the name of Vuhledar. In this video we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the settlement, trying to destroy as many as possible Ukrainian positions in the northern and the northeastern parts, most likely those parts where the Russians are planning to enter in the very near future. So we expect additional changes on the ground in the direction of this settlement and maybe on the territory of this settlement itself. Obviously, the next thing that the Russians will try to establish and to establish control over is these territories, this small pocket between the settlement of Veselovka, the settlement of Loknya, Yunakivka and Yablunivka. This will allow the Russians to get a bit closer to the main supply line NO7 and to establish probably even physical or complete FPV drone control and obviously artillery control over this territory. Now let's talk about the Gornal direction. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of Miropolye. The Ukrainians continue bringing their additional forces to the territory of this settlement with the purpose to stabilize the situation and to repel possible upcoming attack of the Russian forces. We expect that this offensive operation is going to start very soon, but as for now the Russians have a lot of things to do. They destroy and attack Ukrainian positions, temporary deployment points, and of course FPV drone operators' bases. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupyansk direction. As for the northern part, during the previous 12 hours we haven't received anything, just several videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking the northern part of the city of Kupyansk with the purpose to destroy temporary deployment points and masses of Ukrainian forces. Anyway, we see that since the beginning of April, the biggest number of updates are coming exactly from the northern part. So we see the concentration of icons, the concentration of icons in this area is much bigger in comparison with the concentration of icons in this pocket, which means that currently this is the priority target for the Russians, and most likely this concentration confirms that there are still very heavy clashes for the settlements of Kondrashovka, Tishenkovka and Radkovka. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. Obviously the situation here is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians, but as for now the situation is stable. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupyansk direction or the Lyman direction. According to information we have, during the previous night, during the previous 12 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. As a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to maintain the lines between Novomikhailivka and the settlement of Makiivka. This information, as you can see, was provided by neutral mappers and by different pro-Russian resources. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the south of the settlement of Nova, and the Russians managed to get the southeastern part of the settlement by the name of Lipova. So we see that the Russians managed to outflank the village of Nopova, and the Russians are about to begin assault operations towards the settlement of Lipova, which will allow the Russians to cut Ukrainians on the territory of Nova in Cauldron. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians slowly but step by step began advancing in the southwestern direction with the purpose to get as close as possible to the city of Lyman. First, of course, they're going to have to fight for the settlement of Kolodezi, and we have additional reports and additional icons about this, but obviously the next target is the settlement of Lyman. So the Russians most likely, after a very long operational pause, resume their offensive operations, and the next several weeks we're going to see a lot of updates from this territory. As for the primary target for first stage of this offensive is to get as close as possible and to establish even physical control over the river of Nitrius, which will be something like the barrier, let's say not the barrier, even the wall or protection, natural protection for the Russian, let's say, western flank. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Siversk direction, because today we got a very important update. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that the Russian sources published too many icons, too many events came to us from this area, which means that the Russians intensified their activities, and during the previous 24 hours we received a lot of updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking and pummeling the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Serebryanki forest and around the city of Siversk, Verkhnykamensk, Serebryanka, and of course Grigorovka, and we projected that most likely the Russians were about to begin another offensive operation with the purpose to improve their positions along the line of combat contact. And today we got geolocation that confirmed Russian control over the eastern outskirts of the settlement of Grigorovka. We have this video that was published by the 81st Air Mobile Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, where we can see how the Ukrainians were attacking positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation in these fields in the vicinity of the settlement of Grigorovka. Based on this video and based on these episodes that we have in this video, for example, this is exactly the moment. We have adjusted the map because now we have proofs that Ukrainians attacked the eastern position, the positions on the eastern part of the Grigorovka, with the purpose to probably force the Russians to fall back or to destroy their concentrations. So we see that the Russians answered the village, and most likely during the next several days this village will be taken by the Russians completely. So with the fall of the village of Grigorovka, the Russians will begin assault operation on the settlement of Serebryanka, and with the fall of Serebryanka, the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back from Serebryanka forest from this area further in the western directions towards the settlement of Yampol, and the Russians will be able to begin offensive operation in the northeastern part of the city of Siversk. So the battle for this area most likely has begun. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the city of Chasiv Yar, where the clash is intensifying as well. The Russians continue assault operation in the central part, and today we start receiving videos how Ukrainians were trying to evacuate from this area their soldiers and servicemen, but the Russians were attacking them with FPV drones. So Ukrainians began evacuation from the central part because they understand most likely the Russians will clear this territory in the very near future. At the same time, today we got reports, more precisely confirmations, that the Russians managed to attack and answer the settlement of Stupachki. This is something like the southern outskirts of the settlement of Chasiv Yar. So the Russians are taking this city of Chasiv Yar in pincers, and telling the truth, as we discussed in the previous videos, that are very likely that the Russians will be able to establish control over more than 80% of the city of Chasiv Yar before the 9th of May, which is obviously going to be the biggest media victory since the beginning of 2025. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Torets-Konstantinovka direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions in fields. Additional positions and strongholds were taken by the Russians. We have Ukrainians that were attacking the Russians in this area. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map in the fields and around these two lakes. So the Russians continue advancing, as we discussed in the previous video, in the northern direction along the railways and along 0519 road, with the purpose to get as close as possible to the line Alexander Shultina, Belaya Gora and Deliivka. Now let's move further. As for the Kliban-Byrska direction, today we got nothing. I remind you that yesterday we haven't received almost anything as well. Just several reports that the Russians answered Stara Nikolaevka. Small adjustments in comparison with the previous period of Russian offensive. Today we haven't received anything, as you can see, but most likely today we're going to receive some updates, but most likely we're going to get them by the end of the 28th of April of this local time. Now let's talk about the Pokrovsk direction, because the clashes here are intensifying. And today we have lots of reports, as you can see, from the triangle Mirolubovka, Malinovka, Vodyana, and Drugoye. So the Russians, as you can see, continue offensive, and we have lots of updates. First of all, most of the mappers today adjusted the settlement of Berezovka in the Russian favor, because we have lots of videos where we can see how Ukrainians were attacking and FPV droning the positions, of the armored force of the Russian Federation in this site, and most of the mappers, based on these two videos, these two episodes, adjusted their maps in Russian favor. So we haven't adjusted anything, because the village of Berezovka, according probably to the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, was taken a long time ago. Anyway, we have additional changes. According to several mappers, the Russians took under control this injunction of roads, and now the Russians are about to begin offensive operation on this company's stronghold that is located along N32 road, which is most likely the next target for the Russians. And the Russians began advancing from the settlement of Yelizavetovka along these tree lines, along this river, towards the settlement of Malinovka, which is very important. This information today was also provided us by different but very reliable pro-Russian resources. Tarasovka area, fighters of the 33rd Regiment have almost completely liberated or taken the village. Fighting is underway for several houses in the northern part. Berezovka has been taken under Russian control. Attacks are underway north of Yelizavetovka. There is a progress. So this information was provided by a pro-Russian resource, so that is why they're using all these words. So we see that the Russians continue offensive. Most likely the battle for Mirolubovka, Russian attempt to attack Mirolubovka, failed, and the Russians were forced to fall back. Anyway, we haven't received anything from this area probably since the beginning of Russian offensive that took place several weeks or days ago. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Novopavlovka or the Dnipro direction, where the Russians also improved their positions in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Nadeevka. Today, the Ukrainian sources confirmed that the settlement was taken by the Russians completely, and the Russians continue advancing in the northwestern direction with the purpose to get as close as possible to the settlement of Muravka, Kotlarovka, and Novoalexandrovka. So the Russians are trying to dig in deeper in this defense between these settlements and to cut this territory into many pieces, which they will then handle with every single one separately. The Russians continue offensive in the direction of Bogatyr Alexeyevka. According to several sources, the Russians improved their positions in these fields. They took under control several strongholds, fortifications, and tree lines. The Russians continue advancing, as you can see. And another important thing, that the Russians during the previous nights managed to improve their positions on their way to the settlement of Bogatyr from the southeast. As for now, without let's say entering the village itself, I reminded that the Russians are trying to attack the settlement of Bogatyr. Probably have been trying since the beginning of April or even since the beginning of March, but all those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians. They hold their lines, but despite the fact that Ukrainians hold their lines, the Russians every single day are getting closer and closer, and we believe that with this, Russians will be able to get the southeastern part and to enter this village probably in the next 1 or 2 weeks. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the village of Veselaya. Today we got a very important video published by the Russian sources. In this video we can see how the Russian drone was flying above the settlement of Veselaya and how the Russians were dropping the lists where they were suggesting Ukrainians to surrender. I'd remind you that the Russians established complete control over the settlement of Veselaya according to the Minister of Defense and probably according to different geolocations when the Russians raised their flags several weeks ago. But now we see a video where the Russians, as you can see, were dropping lists suggesting Ukrainians to surrender, which means that most likely either the Ukrainians counterattacked and managed to restore control over this territory, or the Russians probably, let's say, dropped applications in different places, or they were making video for media purposes. As for now, we don't have enough of updates, enough of details to understand what is happening, but once again, according to this video, the village of Veselaya is under complete Ukrainian control. As for now, we are waiting for additional details and geolocations, but if this information confirms, then we will adjust the map, of course, in Ukrainian favor. As for the Orekhov direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got just one video how the Russians were bombing and attacking with multiple launch rocket systems the former prison that is located in the southern part of the settlement of Mala Takmachka, but nothing more. So I reminded that the latest update we got, Ukrainians managed to counterattack and to restore the southeastern part of Orekhov and Mala Takmachka, and now the Russians, as we can see, are trying to attack Ukrainians with the purpose probably to slow them down. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Dnipro direction, because today we got very important updates. We got several very important updates from the area between Krynki and Tyaginka. First of all, several pro-Russian resources and mappers adjusted their maps with the next note. Kherson direction, the Dnipro group of forces established control over the islands between Krynki and the Kazakh camps. So the Russians managed to establish complete control over these islands according to pro-Russian resources. Furthermore, according to several pro-Russian very reliable resources, the armed force of the Russian Federation managed to cross the river of Dnipro and to establish complete control over several positions and strongholds on the Ukrainian side of the river. The units of the Dnipro group of forces quietly occupied the islands between Krynki and Kazachie Lageri. There is unconfirmed information that Russians were able to cross the river to the right bank of the Dnipro and enter the southern part of Tyaginka. If this confirmation is confirmed, then what is happening can be considered as the beginning of the liberation of the Kherson region. That was stated by pro-Russian resources. Moreover, the Ukrainians admits the presence of sabotage and reconnaissance group on the right bank of and yesterday announced battles in the Tyaginka area. So something is happening here, and if everything that we have just discussed is correct, then the Russians have already established complete control over something like this. Of course, as for now, we're not going to adjust the map. We're waiting for additional updates and details, but obviously this information is very interesting. If this information indeed is correct, then obviously this is the beginning of complete collapse of Ukrainian defense in the southern part of Ukraine. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.